The marble floor of Thornfield Hall's drawing room stretched before Emily Dawson like an endless white sea, each tile a small mirror reflecting her hunched form. Her knees ached. They always ached by midday. But she had learned long ago that acknowledging pain served no purpose. The brush moved in steady circles, soap and water erasing the morning's dust, restoring the stone to its cold perfection. 3 years of widowhood had taught her this. Invisibility was both burden and mercy. The aristocrats who owned these grand houses rarely noticed the women who scrubbed their floors, and Emily had made peace with that particular kindness. She was 26 years old and had once been called pretty, had once read poetry by candlelight in her father's vicarage, had once believed the world held gentleness for women like her. Those days belonged to someone else now. Good heavens, is that creature still here? The voice cut through the quiet like glass shattering. Emily's hands stilled, though she did not look up. She knew that voice. Lady Constance Ashford, niece to the Duke of Ashmont, visiting Thornfield for the autumn season. Beautiful, wealthy, cruel in the casual way of those who had never known consequence. I thought the housekeeper would have cleared the servants away by now. Another voice, simpering and amused. We wished to take tea in here, Constance. Emily kept her eyes on the floor, her pulse thrumming in her throat. She should leave. She should gather her things and slip away before... The sound of liquid hitting marble made her flinch. Oh dear, Lady Constance said, her tone dripping with false concern. How clumsy of me. I've spilled tea all over the floor. What a mess. Emily looked up then, unable to stop herself. The tea had splashed across the tiles she'd just cleaned, dark and spreading, and Lady Constance stood above her, porcelain cup dangling from her fingers, a smile curving her perfect mouth. Well, the lady said, are you not going to clean it? 2 other young women stood behind Constance, their faces alight with anticipation. They wanted a show. They wanted to watch her grovel. Emily reached for her cloth. You know, Constance continued, circling slowly. I heard you were once a gentlewoman. A vicar's daughter, was it? How extraordinary. And now look at you, on your knees, scrubbing floors like the lowest scullery maid. Tell me, does it hurt? The fall from grace? The words landed like stones. Emily wrung out her cloth and began wiping the tea, her movements mechanical, her face carefully blank. She had learned this too. Silence was armor. What a pathetic creature, Constance murmured to her companions, loud enough for Emily to hear. I wonder if she even remembers what it was like to be human. That will be quite enough, Constance. The new voice was male, deep, and cold as winter frost. Every woman in the room went still. Emily's breath caught. She did not need to look up to know who had entered. The sudden tension in the air, the way Constance's expression shifted from triumph to something more calculated, told her everything. But she looked up anyway, helpless against some instinct she could not name. The Duke of Ashmont stood in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black superfine that spoke of wealth so immense it required no ostentation. Dark hair, darker eyes, a face that might have been carved from stone save for the sudden, startling intensity of his gaze. A gaze fixed directly on Emily. The world tilted. She knew those eyes. She had seen them before, 20 years ago, wide with terror and cold, so cold, as she'd pulled him from the frozen lake behind the Ashmont estate. He had been a boy then, 12 years old and drowning, and she had been 8, small but fierce. Her father's lessons about duty and courage driving her into the icy water without thought. He had looked at her then with gratitude and wonder. He was looking at her now with recognition. Your Grace, Constance said quickly, her voice honeyed. We were just... Amusing yourselves at the expense of someone who cannot defend herself? Alexander Grayson, 6th Duke of Ashmont, stepped into the room, and it seemed to Emily that the very air bent around him. How delightful. Please, do continue. I find cruelty so entertaining. The sarcasm was brutal, precise. Constance flushed crimson. We were merely... Leave. The single word carried the weight of absolute authority. All of you. Now. The 3 young women fled like startled birds, their skirts rustling in their haste. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and Emily was alone with the Duke. Alone with the boy she had saved. She should stand. She should curtsy. She should do something other than kneel here on the wet floor, frozen like a rabbit before a wolf. But her limbs would not obey, and her throat had closed around any words she might have spoken. Please, he said, and his voice had gentled. Let me help you. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and extended his hand. A hand clad in a fine leather glove. A hand that had never known labor. A hand offering to lift her from the floor as though she were a lady and not a servant. Emily stared at that hand. Some part of her, some foolish, aching part, wanted desperately to take it, to let him pull her up, to pretend for one brief moment that she was still the girl who had saved him, still someone worthy of kindness. But that girl was gone. Thank you, Your Grace, she said quietly, rising to her feet without assistance. Her knees protested, her back screamed, but she stood straight and met his eyes for precisely 1 heartbeat before lowering her gaze. But I can manage on my own. Can you? There was something strange in his voice, something that might have been pain or wonder or both. What is your name? She hesitated. Giving her name felt like giving him a piece of herself, and she had so few pieces left. Emily Dawson, Your Grace. Dawson, he repeated, tasting the syllables. Then, carefully, but you were not always Dawson, were you? Her heart hammered against her ribs. No, Your Grace, I was Emily Hartwell before my marriage. Hartwell. The recognition in his eyes blazed brighter. Your father was the vicar at Ashmont Village. Yes. The word came out barely above a whisper. You lived in the small cottage near the estate. You had dark hair even then, and green eyes, and you... He stopped as though he'd run out of breath. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. You were there, by the lake, 20 years ago. It was you. It was not a question. Emily's throat tightened. She could lie. She should lie. But she had never been skilled at deception, and the truth pushed past her lips before she could stop it. Yes, Your Grace. The silence that followed felt enormous, heavy with things unsaid. He was staring at her as though she were a ghost, as though he could not quite believe she was real. And perhaps she was a ghost, the ghost of the girl who had dragged a drowning boy to shore, who had wrapped him in her wool cloak, who had held his freezing hands until the servants came running. I looked for you, he said finally. After my father sent me away to school. I came back years later and asked after the vicar's family. They said you had married and moved away. I never knew... He broke off, his jaw tightening. I never knew you had come to this. Shame flooded through her, hot and bitter. She did not want his pity. She did not want him to see her like this, reduced, desperate, scrubbing floors in the houses where he was welcomed as an honored guest. I must return to my work, Your Grace, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I beg your pardon for the disruption. Wait! But Emily was already moving, gathering her bucket and brushes with practiced efficiency, years of servitude making the motions automatic. She curtsied quickly, too quickly, nearly losing her balance, and turned toward the servants' entrance. Emily. Her name, not Miss Hartwell, not Mrs. Dawson, But Emily, spoken in a tone that held something dangerous, something that sounded almost like tenderness. She forced herself not to turn around, forced herself to keep walking, forced herself to remember that dukes did not concern themselves with women like her, no matter what kindness they might have shared as children. The door closed behind her, and she sagged against the wall in the dim corridor beyond, pressing one hand to her chest where her heart beat wild and painful. She had thought she had forgotten how to hope. She had thought that particular cruelty had been burned out of her by 3 years of cold rooms and aching knees and endless, invisible labor. She had been wrong. The library at Thornfield Hall smelled of leather and old paper, a scent that had once been as familiar to Emily as her own heartbeat. She moved through the towering shelves with practiced efficiency, her feather duster whisking away dust from gilt-edged spines she would never be permitted to open. The irony was not lost on her. She, who had once devoured books like a starving woman, now tended them like sacred objects she was forbidden to touch. 4 days had passed since the incident in the drawing room. 4 days of careful avoidance, of taking the back stairs when she heard his voice in distant corridors, of finishing her duties in whatever room he was expected to visit before he could arrive. The Duke was a guest at Thornfield for the month, conducting business with the Viscount who owned the estate. Emily had become expert at making herself invisible. But the library was supposed to be empty at this hour. "Do you miss it?" Emily's breath stopped. She turned slowly, heart thundering, to find Alexander Grayson seated in a wing-back chair near the window. So still she had not noticed him in the shadowed corner. A book lay open in his lap, but his eyes were fixed on her with that same unsettling intensity she remembered from their first encounter. "Your Grace," she managed, dipping into a curtsy. "I apologize. I did not realize the library was occupied. I will return later." "Do you miss it?" he repeated, rising from his chair with fluid grace. Reading, the books, the worlds they contained. The question struck her like a physical blow, precise and aimed at the softest part of her. She could lie. She could say that she had no time for such frivolous pursuits, that she was content with her lot, that she had long ago ceased yearning for things beyond her reach. But something in his gaze, something earnest and seeking, made the lies wither on her tongue. "Every day," she admitted quietly. "I miss it every day." He moved closer, and Emily fought the urge to step back. There was something almost predatory in his focus, though she could not name what he was hunting. "What did you love to read?" he asked. "When you were Miss Hartwell, and the world still gave you books." The question was dangerous. It invited intimacy, suggested that he saw her as something more than the servant she had become. But Emily found herself answering anyway, helpless against the pull of his attention. "Poetry," she said. "Byron, Wordsworth, Shelley, and novels, Scott, Austen. My father had a small collection, and I read them all until the pages fell out of the bindings." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I used to imagine myself the heroine of those stories. How foolish." "Not foolish." His voice was soft, almost gentle. "We all need stories that tell us we might be more than what the world has decided for us." She looked up at him then, really looked, and was startled by what she saw. There was no pity in his expression, no condescension, only recognition, as though he understood something essential about her, something she had thought invisible to everyone. "I want you to take a book," he said abruptly. Emily blinked. "Your Grace? From this library. Choose one. Take it with you." He gestured to the shelves surrounding them. "Read it. You have as much right to these stories as anyone." "I could not possibly." "Why not?" "Because I am a servant, and this is not my house, and I—" She stopped, frustrated by her own inability to articulate the 100 reasons why his offer was impossible. Because the world has taught you that you do not deserve beauty, Alexander finished quietly. Because 3 years of scrubbing floors has convinced you that you are only hands in labor, nothing more. The accuracy of his words stole her breath. She stared at him, her chest tight with something that might have been grief or fury or longing. I am the Duke of Ashmont, he continued, taking another step closer. If I say you may borrow a book from Thornfield's library, then no one will gainsay me. So I ask you again, Emily, which book do you want? The use of her given name sent heat flooding through her. She should correct him, insist on proper address, maintain the barrier that ought to exist between them. But the barrier was already crumbling, had been crumbling since the moment he'd recognized her, and Emily was too tired to hold it up alone. She turned to the shelves, running her fingers along familiar spines, and selected a slender volume without conscious thought. Wordsworth. Lyrical ballads. She had owned a copy once, had memorized whole passages, had wept over Tintern Abbey on quiet evenings. This one, she whispered, holding it out to him as though seeking permission. He took the book from her hands, his gloved fingers brushing hers for one brief electric moment. Then he opened it to a random page and read aloud, his voice low and musical. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity. Emily's eyes burned. She knew the passage. She had always known it. Nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue, she continued softly, the words rising from memory. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts. They spoke the final lines together, their voices intertwining, of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man. Silence fell, profound and trembling. Alexander's eyes had never left her face, and Emily could not look away, could not pretend she did not feel the pull between them. Dangerous, impossible, real. Keep it, he said roughly. The book. Keep it as long as you need. Your Grace! Alexander. The correction was firm, almost desperate. When we are alone, please. Just Alexander. I cannot, Emily said, and her voice broke on the words. You know I cannot. You are a duke, and I am the woman who saved my life. A servant, she finished, the word falling like a stone between them. A widow, with no name, no fortune, no position. Calling you by your Christian name will not change what I am. Then perhaps, he said quietly, it is what I am that needs changing. Before she could respond, before she could process the weight of what he had just implied, he pressed the book into her hands and stepped back, creating distance that felt more like violence than courtesy. I will not keep you from your work, he said formally, his expression shuddering. Forgive me for the intrusion. He left the library without looking back, and Emily stood alone among the shelves, clutching Wordsworth to her chest like a talisman, her heart a wild and wounded thing. The gardens of Thornfield Hall were not particularly grand. A modest rose arbor, a gravel path circling a small fountain, hedges trimmed into sensible shapes. But they were quiet, and after a morning spent polishing silver until her hands ached, Emily treasured quiet. She sat on a stone bench hidden behind the hedge, Wordsworth open in her lap, stealing 15 precious minutes before she was expected in the kitchens. The October air was crisp, scented with earth and dying roses, and for a moment, just a moment, she could pretend she was someone else. Someone who had the right to sit in gardens and read poetry. I thought I might find you here. Emily's head snapped up. Alexander stood at the entrance to her hidden alcove, his tall frame blocking the path, his expression unreadable. Your Grace, she said, rising quickly and dropping the book as though it burned her. I am not neglecting my duties, I promise. I only— Peace, Emily. He raised one hand, a gesture of reassurance. I am not here to scold you. I hoped— that is, I wondered if you might walk with me, just for a while. That would be most inappropriate, Your Grace. Would it? He tilted his head, and something in his posture reminded her absurdly of the boy he had been. Earnest, a bit stubborn, unused to being refused. I am inviting you to walk in a garden in broad daylight. What scandal could possibly arise from such a thing? Every scandal, Emily said bluntly. You are a duke. I am a servant. If we are seen together— Then we will be seen together, he interrupted. Emily, please, He stopped, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain. I need to speak with you. Truly speak with you. And I find I cannot do so when you are looking at the ground instead of at me. It was unfair, the way he said it. Unfair to invoke vulnerability, to ask for something she desperately wanted to give, but could not afford to surrender. Emily closed her eyes briefly, gathering what remained of her resolve. 5 minutes, she said. No more. Relief washed over his features, so naked and pure that Emily's chest ached. He offered his arm, another impossibility, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked in silence down the gravel path, the crunch of their footsteps the only sound. Emily was acutely conscious of his proximity, the solid strength of his arm beneath her hand, the way he shortened his stride to match hers. It felt like a dream, the kind she had upon waking, beautiful and already fading. I want to tell you something, Alexander said finally, about the day you saved me. You do not need to— Please. He stopped walking, turned to face her. Let me tell you this. I need you to understand. Emily nodded, unable to speak. I was 12 years old, he began, his voice low and controlled. And my mother had died that spring. I was broken, angry. I spent every day trying to outrun the grief, and that day I went to the lake. It was early winter, barely frozen, and I thought— He paused, swallowing hard. I thought if I could just walk across it, reach the other side, I could prove I was strong enough. That I did not need anyone. Emily's throat tightened. She remembered the crack of ice, the splash, the terrible silence after. I fell through, he continued. The cold was— I cannot describe it. It was like knives, like drowning in knives. And I could not breathe, could not think. I was sinking, and I knew I was going to die there, alone, because I had been too proud to ask for help. His eyes met hers, dark and haunted. And then there was a hand, small, impossibly strong, pulling me up, dragging me to shore. And when I could finally see again, there was a little girl with dark hair and green eyes, soaking wet, wrapping me in her cloak even though she was shivering. And she said, Do you remember what you said? Emily shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. You said, It is all right now. You are safe. I promise you are safe. His voice broke on the last word. No one had said anything like that to me since my mother died, and I believed you, completely. Your Grace. My father sent me away the next week, Alexander said. To school, to relatives, anywhere but Ashmont. He said the estate held too many painful memories. I wanted to find you, to thank you, but by the time I returned years later, you were gone. And I thought— He stopped, his jaw working. I thought I had lost the one person who had seen me when I was breaking and still thought I was worth saving. Emily could not stop crying now, silent tears that blurred her vision and burned her throat. I only did what anyone would— No. The word was fierce. Not anyone. You were 8 years old, and you jumped into a frozen lake without hesitation. You risked your own life. And then you held my hands until they stopped shaking, and you made me promise I would be more careful. And you... He reached up, cupping her face with one hand, his thumb brushing away her tears. You gave me back my life. And you think that is why you feel... whatever it is you feel now? Emily forced herself to ask. Gratitude? Obligation? I think, Alexander said slowly, that I have been looking for you for 20 years. And now that I have found you, I cannot bear the thought of letting you go. The world seemed to stop turning. Emily stood frozen in his hold, her heart a drum, her mind a chaos of hope and terror and desperate, aching longing. You do not know me, she whispered. The girl I was, she is gone. I am not worth... Do not, he said roughly, his other hand coming up to frame her face. Say that you are not worth my regard. Do not let the cruelty of the world convince you that you are somehow less than you are. But I am less, Emily said, and the words tore from her like confession. I am a widow with no family, no fortune, no prospects. I scrub floors, Alexander. I am invisible to everyone who matters. And you are a duke. You could have anyone. You should have someone who can stand beside you as an equal, not someone who... You saved my life, he interrupted fiercely. You gave me compassion when I needed it most. You read Wordsworth and Shelley, and you understand the still, sad music of humanity. And when you look at me, you do not see a title or a fortune. You see me. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious? Emily shook her head helplessly, lost in the intensity of his gaze, drowning in the impossibility of what he was offering. I do not want an equal, Alexander said quietly. I want you. And then he kissed her. It was soft, hesitant, a question more than a demand. His lips brushed hers with a gentleness that broke something inside her, some last fragile wall she had built against the world's cruelty. Emily gasped against his mouth, and he made a low sound in his throat, his hands tightening on her face, the kiss deepening into something more urgent, more real. For 10 heartbeats, Emily let herself have this. Let herself pretend that she could be the heroine of her own story, that love could bridge the chasm between Duchess and servant, that wanting something desperately could make it possible. And then reality crashed back in. She pulled away, stumbling backward, her hand pressed to her lips. No, she said, her voice ragged. No, we cannot. This cannot. Emily, I will not be your charity, your grace. The formal address was deliberate, a weapon to create distance. I will not be your noble project, the poor widow you rescued from poverty to soothe your conscience. You think that is what this is? Alexander's voice was raw, almost angry. You think I would kiss you out of pity? What else could it be? Emily demanded, her own anger rising to meet his. You do not know what it is to be invisible, to be nothing. You cannot understand what it means to have people look through you as though you do not exist. And I cannot. I will not be visible only to you. I cannot survive on one person's regard when the rest of the world sees me as less than human. Then let me change the world's regard, he said desperately. Let me... You cannot, Emily said, and her voice broke on a sob. You cannot change what I am, and I will not let you. Destroy yourself trying. She turned and ran before he could respond, ran through the gardens and back into the cold stone corridors of Thornfield, ran until her lungs burned and her vision blurred, ran until she reached the tiny attic room she shared with 2 other servants and collapsed on her narrow bed, pressing her face into her pillow to muffle the sounds of her weeping. The taste of him lingered on her lips, sweet and impossible, a reminder of everything she could never have. The envelope arrived 3 days later, delivered to the servants' hall by a footman who looked vaguely uncomfortable with his errand. Emily stared at the heavy cream paper, at the ducal seal pressed into crimson wax, at her name written in an elegant hand across the front. Miss Emily Dawson. Not Mrs., not servant. Miss, a designation of respect she had not been afforded in years. Well? Mrs. Halloway, the head housekeeper, peered over her shoulder with undisguised curiosity. Are you going to open it, girl, or just stare at it until it bursts into flame? Emily's hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Miss Dawson, I request the honor of your presence at Ashmont House this Friday evening at 7 o'clock. A carriage will be sent to convey you. This is not a request for labor. You are invited as a guest. I remain your servant, Alexander Grayson. Duke of Ashmont. Emily read the words 3 times, her heart hammering harder with each pass. A guest. He had invited her as a guest to his London residence, to what would undoubtedly be some formal dinner or reception, where she would be expected to. She could not. She absolutely could not. Well? Mrs. Halloway prompted again, her tone gentler now. What does His Grace want? He has invited me to dinner, Emily said faintly. As a guest. The housekeeper's eyebrows rose to her hairline. Has he now? How extraordinary! She studied Emily with shrewd eyes. And will you go? I cannot. I have nothing to wear, and I do not belong in such company, and it would be cowardly, Mrs. Halloway finished bluntly. To refuse. Emily looked up sharply. I beg your pardon? I have worked in great houses for 30 years, child, the older woman said, crossing her arms. I have seen dukes and duchesses and all manner of nobility come and go, and I can tell you this. The Duke of Ashmont looks at you the way my late husband looked at me on our wedding day. Like you are the only thing in the world worth seeing. He pities me. He loves you, Mrs. Halloway corrected firmly, whether you believe it or not. And if you refuse this invitation, if you let fear keep you from even discovering what he means to do, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Emily's throat closed around a reply. The housekeeper's words echoed Alexander's, both of them insisting she was worth more than her circumstances suggested. But wanting to believe something, and being able to believe it were different. Creatures entirely. Go, Mrs. Halloway said softly. Just go, and see what happens. The worst that can occur is you have one evening of beauty before returning to this life. Is that not worth the risk? Emily looked down at the invitation again, at Alexander's signature, at the impossible promise contained in those few lines. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will go. Mrs. Halloway smiled, and it transformed her stern features into something almost tender. Good girl. Now, let us see about finding you a dress. Ashmont House stood in Mayfair like a monument to wealth and power. 4 stories of pale stone, windows blazing with light, carriages lined along the street disgorging elegantly dressed men and women who ascended the front steps as though entering a palace. Emily sat frozen in the hired carriage that had collected her from Thornfield, her hands twisted in the fabric of her borrowed dress, terror a living thing in her chest. She could not do this. The dress Mrs. Halloway had procured, a simple dove-gray silk that had once belonged to the Viscount's youngest daughter, was beautiful but modest, appropriate for a dinner party but not for whatever grand affair seemed to be unfolding before her. Emily looked like what she was, a poor relation invited out of charity, a stray brought in from the cold. Miss? The driver twisted in his seat, his expression kind. His Grace said to tell you he is waiting, if you are ready. Alexander was waiting. For her. Emily drew a shaking breath and stepped down from the carriage. The entrance hall of Ashmont House stole what little remained of her composure. Marble floors, of course, always marble, stretched beneath a chandelier dripping with crystal, and a massive staircase curved upward toward unseen floors. Servants in ducal livery moved with practiced efficiency, And everywhere she looked, aristocrats glittered like jewels, their laughter and conversation filling the air with refined noise. "Miss Dawson?" Emily turned to find a tall, auburn-haired gentleman approaching, his expression curious but not unkind. He was perhaps 30, handsome in an understated way, dressed with the casual perfection of old money. "I am Lord Julian Grey," he said, bowing with impeccable courtesy. "His Grace asked me to watch for your arrival and ensure you were comfortable. May I escort you to the drawing room?" Yes, thank you." Emily's voice came out barely above a whisper. Lord Julian offered his arm, and she took it gratefully, needing the support as he guided her through the throng of guests. She felt every eye that landed on her, felt the weight of curious stares and whispered speculation. The dove-gray dress that had seemed so lovely in her small room at Thornfield now felt painfully inadequate, a costume that fooled no one. The drawing room was even more overwhelming than the entrance hall. Silk wallpaper, gilt-framed paintings, furniture that probably cost more than Emily would earn in a lifetime. At least 40 people filled the space, clustered in small groups, their conversation a sophisticated buzz punctuated by laughter. And there, near the fireplace, stood Alexander. He was dressed in black evening clothes, his dark hair swept back from his face, his posture radiating the unconscious authority of a man born to command. He was speaking with an older gentleman, but the moment Emily entered, his gaze snapped to her as though pulled by some invisible thread. The relief that washed over his features was almost painful to witness. He excused himself from his companion and crossed the room with purposeful strides, his eyes never leaving hers. Emily's heart hammered so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. "Emily," he said softly, and the way he spoke her name, like a prayer, like a promise, made her chest ache. "You came. You invited me, Your Grace," she managed. It would have been rude to refuse. Something flickered in his expression, hurt perhaps that she had retreated behind formality, but he merely inclined his head and offered his arm. "Then allow me to introduce you to some of the other guests." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of names and faces, none of which Emily could retain. Alexander remained at her side, his presence a solid anchor. And if anyone thought it strange that the Duke of Ashmont devoted himself entirely to the modest young woman in gray silk, they were too polite to say so. But Emily felt it, the weight of judgment, the curiosity bordering on speculation. These people knew she did not belong, even if they did not yet know precisely why. "There you are, Uncle." The voice cut through the ambient conversation like a knife. Emily turned to see Lady Constance Ashford gliding toward them, resplendent in emerald silk, her blonde curls artfully arranged, her beauty weapon sharp. Constance's eyes landed on Emily, and her perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of exaggerated surprise. "Good heavens! Uncle, surely this cannot be your little pet from Thornfield?" The words landed like blows. Emily felt rather than saw Alexander stiffen beside her. "Lady Constance," he said coldly, "how delightful that you could join us." "I would not have missed this for the world," Constance purred, her gaze raking over Emily with unconcealed disdain. "Though I confess I am shocked to find that you have invited— what shall we call her? Your charity project? Your latest cause?" "You will address Miss Dawson with respect," Alexander said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Miss Dawson," Constance repeated, savoring each syllable. "How quaint. Tell me, Miss Dawson, what is it like to dine with your betters? Does it not make you dreadfully uncomfortable, knowing that everyone here can see precisely what you are?" Emily's face burned. She wanted to flee, to vanish into the floor the way she had learned to do at Thornfield. But something in Alexander's rigid posture, in the protective fury radiating from him, made her straighten her spine instead. "I am quite comfortable, Lady Constance," she said quietly, "though I thank you for your concern." "Concern?" Constance laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Oh, you misunderstand. I am not concerned. I am simply fascinated by the spectacle. The Duke of Ashmont, one of England's most eligible men, entertaining a servant at his table. What theater this is!" The conversations around them had begun to falter, heads turning toward the commotion. Emily felt the attention like physical pressure, dozens of eyes witnessing her humiliation. "Tell me," Constance continued, raising her voice just enough to ensure the nearby guests could hear. "Do you still scrub floors, Miss Dawson? Or has my uncle elevated you to more intimate services?" The implication was clear, deliberate, vicious. Gasps rippled through the drawing room. Emily's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed, her hands clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palms. "Constance." Alexander's voice was arctic, each syllable sharp enough to cut. "That is quite enough." "Is it?" Constance tilted her head, all false innocence. "I am merely asking questions everyone here is thinking. We are all wondering what possible reason you could have for debasing yourself with—" "Be silent." The command cracked through the air like a whip. The drawing room fell utterly still, every conversation dying mid-word. Alexander stood rigid, his eyes blazing with an anger so controlled it was terrifying. "You will apologize to Miss Dawson," he said, each word deliberate and cold. "You will apologize now, or you will leave this house and never return." Constance paled, her confidence faltering for the first time. "Uncle, now." Lady Constance's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Then, with visible effort, she turned to Emily and bit out, "I apologize for any offense." The apology was worthless, hollow, but Alexander nodded curtly. "Leave us, all of you." He raised his voice, addressing the entire room. "Please adjourn to the dining room. Dinner will be served momentarily." The guests filed out in a rustle of silk and murmured speculation, casting curious glances over their shoulders. Lord Julian appeared at Emily's side, his expression concerned, but Alexander waved him away as well. Within moments, they were alone. Emily could not look at him, could not bear to see pity or regret in his face, could not endure the knowledge that she had been right all along. This was impossible. She did not belong here. She never would. "Emily," Alexander said softly. She shook her head, still staring at the floor. "You should not have." She was right. Everyone was thinking it. "I do not belong in this world, and pretending otherwise only makes it worse. Look at me." The command was gentle but absolute. Emily raised her eyes reluctantly, expecting to see disappointment, perhaps even relief that she finally understood the futility of whatever this was between them. Instead, she saw determination. "You are correct," Alexander said quietly. "You do not belong in this world." The words struck like a physical blow, even though Emily had been thinking them herself. She took a step backward, her throat closing around a sob. "This world," Alexander continued, his voice strengthening, "is cruel and petty and values nothing but birth and fortune. This world measures human worth by titles and property. This world would see you on your knees scrubbing floors and call that justice." He moved closer, his gaze fierce and unwavering. "You do not belong in this world, Emily, because you are better than it. Because you have more honor in your smallest finger than most of these people possess in their entire bodies." "That is not— Alexander, you cannot—" "I can," he interrupted. "And I will. Come with me." He took her hand, not her arm, but her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and drew her toward the dining room. Emily stumbled after him, her mind reeling, unable to process what was happening. The dining room was magnificent. A long table set with crystal and silver, candles blazing in candelabras, the assembled guests already seated and watching with undisguised curiosity as Alexander entered with Emily in tow. He led her to the head of the table, to the seat of honor at his right hand, and pulled out her chair himself. Emily sank into it numbly, aware of every stare, every whispered comment, every judgmental gaze. Alexander remained standing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room. "Thank you for joining me this evening. Before we dine, I wish to tell you a story." Emily's heart stopped. 20 years ago, Alexander continued, I was 12 years old and drowning. The ice had broken beneath me, and I was sinking into a lake so cold that every breath felt like knives in my lungs. I was going to die alone because I had been too proud, too arrogant to understand my own limitations. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, ensuring he had every person's attention. A child saved me that day. An 8-year-old girl who saw me fall through the ice and did not hesitate. She jumped into that frozen water without a thought for her own safety, dragged me to shore, and then held my freezing hands until help arrived. She saved my life. Emily could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything but stare at Alexander as he spoke, his words reshaping reality around her. That child was Miss Emily Dawson, he said, turning to look directly at her. The woman seated beside me now. The woman some of you have looked upon with disdain tonight, wondering what possible reason I could have for honoring her presence in my home. The silence in the room was absolute. I have spent 20 years looking for her, Alexander continued, his voice rough with emotion. 20 years wondering what had become of the brave, compassionate child who taught me that true nobility has nothing to do with titles. And when I found her again, I discovered she had fallen on difficult circumstances, not through any fault of her own, but through the simple cruelty of fate. He turned back to address the room, and his expression had transformed into something Emily had never seen before. Righteous fury tempered by absolute certainty. You have all been taught, he said quietly, that worth is measured by birth. That a duke is inherently superior to a servant. That aristocratic blood conveys some magical virtue. But I have met servants with more integrity than most lords. And I have met ladies. His gaze flicked briefly to where Constance sat, white-faced, with less honor than the poorest widow. Alexander moved then, stepping away from the table, and Emily watched in dawning shock as he circled around to stand directly in front of her chair. Miss Emily Dawson has more nobility in a single action than most people achieve in a lifetime, he said, his eyes locked on hers. She risked her life for a stranger. She has endured poverty and loss with grace and dignity. She reads Wordsworth and understands the still, sad music of humanity. And when she looks at me, she does not see a title or a fortune. She sees a man. He sank to one knee before her. The collective gasp that rippled through the room might have been audible in the street outside. Emily's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, her whole body trembling. I am not offering you charity, Emily, Alexander said, his voice breaking on her name. I am not trying to save you. You saved me, 20 years ago, and again when I had forgotten what it meant to see someone truly. I am offering you my heart, my name, my life, if you will have them. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring, a single sapphire surrounded by diamonds, glittering in the candlelight. Miss Dawson, he said formally, though his voice shook. Emily, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? The room held its breath. Emily could feel 40 pairs of eyes on her, could sense the shock and scandal rippling through the assembled aristocrats. Lady Constance looked as though she might faint. Lord Julian was grinning openly. But none of it mattered. None of it mattered because Alexander was kneeling before her, offering her not rescue but partnership, not pity but love. Because he had stood before the entire cream of London society and declared that she, Emily Dawson, penniless widow, invisible servant, was worth more than all their titles combined, because he saw her, truly saw her, and thought her beautiful. "Yes," Emily whispered. Then, louder, her voice steadying. "Yes, Alexander. Yes, I will marry you." The smile that transformed his face was incandescent, pure joy that made him look young and unguarded. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though made for her, and then stood, pulling her up with him and into his arms. He kissed her there, in front of everyone, his hands cradling her face as though she were infinitely precious. Emily kissed him back, tasting salt from her own tears, feeling the solid reality of him against her, and let herself believe, finally, completely, that this was real. When they broke apart, the dining room erupted in applause. Not everyone was clapping. Constance had fled, and several older matrons looked scandalized. But enough people were smiling, were standing to offer congratulations, that Emily felt the acceptance like warmth spreading through her chest. "Well?" Lord Julian called out cheerfully from his seat, raising his wine glass. "That was the most extraordinary proposal I have ever witnessed. To the Duke and his Duchess." "To the Duke and Duchess!" The room echoed, and Emily laughed through her tears, overwhelmed and impossibly happy. Alexander kept her hand clasped in his throughout the dinner that followed, his thumb tracing absent circles on her palm, as though he could not quite believe she was real. And Emily, seated in the place of honor, wearing a sapphire ring and a borrowed dress, felt for the first time in 3 years that she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, spring had come to Ashmont Estate, transforming the grounds into a riot of color. Daffodils and tulips blazing in the gardens, cherry trees heavy with blossoms, the lake where everything had begun now reflecting clear blue sky instead of winter's gray. Emily walked the gravel path slowly, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly, a secret she would share with Alexander that evening at dinner. She wore a dress of soft green muslin, her hair loose down her back the way he loved it, and on her finger, the sapphire ring caught the afternoon sunlight and threw it back in brilliant sparks. The Duchess of Ashmont. The title still felt strange, like clothing that did not quite fit. But Emily was learning to wear it, learning that she could be both the girl who had scrubbed floors and the woman who commanded servants, that her past did not diminish her present. The wedding had been a scandal and a wonder. Half the ton had attended out of curiosity, expecting disaster. They had found instead a ceremony of such obvious love and joy that even the most skeptical had been moved. Emily's hand had not trembled when she spoke her vows. She had looked into Alexander's eyes and promised herself to him with the same fierce certainty that had driven her into a frozen lake 2 decades before. "There you are." Emily turned to find her husband approaching, still dressed in riding clothes, his hair wind-tossed, his smile the same one she woke to every morning, tender and wondering, as though he could not quite believe his good fortune. "I was looking for you," he said, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips. "You disappeared after breakfast." "I wanted to see the gardens," Emily said, leaning into his embrace. "And I wanted to visit the lake. I have not been there since I asked you to marry me for the 2nd time," Alexander supplied, amusement coloring his tone. Emily laughed. He had proposed again, privately, beside the lake where she had saved him, the morning after the disastrous dinner party. "I wanted to be certain you meant it," he had said, when there was no one watching, when it was just us. And Emily had said yes again, more certain the 2nd time than the first. Mrs. Halloway sent a letter, Emily said now, settling against Alexander's chest. She wishes to know if we will be in London for the season. Do you want to be in London for the season? Alexander asked, his hand coming up to stroke her hair. Emily considered. 6 months ago, the thought of facing the Ton as the Duchess of Ashmont would have terrified her. But she had survived the wedding, had survived the stares and whispers, and Constance's theatrical departure from the ceremony. She had discovered that with Alexander beside her, she could survive anything. Yes, she said. I think I would like that. I think I would like to show them that I am still here. You are extraordinary, Alexander murmured into her hair. Do you know that? My brave, fierce, extraordinary wife. I am only what I have always been, Emily said. The difference is that now, someone sees it. I see you, Alexander said, turning her in his arms so they stood face to face. I will always see you. Every day for the rest of our lives, I will see you. Emily rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and lingering, tasting happiness and certainty and home. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion. I have something to tell you, she said shyly. Later at dinner, something wonderful. Understanding dawned in his expression, wonder and joy and fierce protectiveness all at once. Emily. Later, she insisted, laughing. Let me have my dramatic announcement. Alexander kissed her again, harder this time, and Emily lost herself in the warmth of him, in the solid reality of his love, in the impossible truth that she, who had been invisible, who had been nothing, was now seen and treasured and home. She was no longer the woman scrubbing floors in borrowed dresses, no longer the widow society had dismissed as inconsequential. She was Emily Grayson, Duchess of Ashmont. She was the woman who had saved a duke and married him. She was a wife, and soon she would be a mother, and she was happy. She was happy. The afternoon sun painted everything gold, the gardens, the lake, the path stretching out before them, and Emily thought of all the heroines in all the novels she had loved as a girl, thought of the happy endings she had stopped believing in. She had found hers. Against all odds, against every rule society had written, she had found her happy ending. And it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined.